Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. I haven't made a lot of content criticizing fascism. Sure, I rip state worship to shreds constantly, but nothing that directly criticizes fascism. So while I, at the time of this recording, am currently working on my video on the 2008 financial crisis, which will easily be my largest video yet, I thought it'd be fun to go into this. I'll be replying to a video by QTUM about why he is a fascist and try to address his concerns. I doubt he'll see the video, but if he does, yeah. The embracing of a coercive monopoly as the only means to solve society's problems is not only unproductive but counterproductive. The amount of times these problems are actually caused or otherwise worsened by government meddling is actually quite astonishing. But anyways, he begins the video explaining he was at a bar, was accused of having fascist views, and when he went home, did research on fascism and found, hey, this is actually pretty great. But let's dig into it. Hit it!
Until I actually started looking into fascism and finding myself agreeing with a majority of the precepts, and this was all but confirmed when I watched V for Vendetta and decided that, the government kind of has a point.
You know the Nosefire Party were complete monsters who regularly engaged in torture, surveillance, and mass murder, whose enforcers were more monstrous than the criminals they were trying to protect society from, yeah? Not a good look if you want to distance your beliefs from the Nazis, just saying.
Now, fascism has been pretty poorly defined and usually by its enemies, and no doubt you'll hear it used to describe anything from the Daily Mail to Donald Trump.
Well, yeah. Fundamentally, fascism is a nationalist idea that will adapt itself to the customs and cultures of their area. The Italian fascism of Benito Mussolini would be much different than the British fascism of Oswald Mosley. Even with that, there are several schools of thought: traditional fascism, clerical fascism, anarcho-fascism, which I'm not going to be touching that one with a 10-foot pole. So I'll sum up what he says next. He compares the role of the government to the family, the father being the protector, provider, and disciplinarian, which, if the role of the father includes disciplinarian, then I genuinely fear for the safety of hatchlings. Considering the role that child abuse plays in perpetuating authoritarianism, it's no surprise he views the father and the state in the same light. Then he describes the mother as a nurturer and educator, which is not accurate at all. Not because he's wrong per se, but because the government usurps the mother's role as educator and nurturer through mandatory government indoctrination. But here we see the first problem with this comparison between the state and the family. If one fills that role, then the other is redundant. What's the point of the existence of fathers if President Trump or Prime Minister Boris Johnson exist? The inverse is also true. If I have my dad, what need do I have for these old farts who give themselves such ridiculous titles? What need do we have of them indeed? But the presence of both creates overlap. It creates redundancy, which can result in confusion if there are conflicts. If the mother teaches their hatchling A, but government schools say B, who's correct? It doesn't just apply to instruction either. There may come a time when a father needs to protect their hatchling from a predatory government, or hatchling needs to be saved from a predatory father. Both the mother and state cannot feed simultaneously. The point is, for one to exist, the other must necessarily recede. Jactian, you need to make your choice. I've made mine, which is one of the reasons I'm an anarchist. If you support the state, and the state, in your mind, must necessarily have the role of the family, then you cannot also say that you are in favor of the family, because these two are going to be mutually exclusive. No amount of special pleading is going to be able to get around this.
It isn't a coincidence that fascism tends to arise from chaos. People seeking order is as natural as people seeking liberty, and denying this is pretty stupid.
The reason people are averse to chaos in the first place is because they don't wish to be aggressed upon, which is perfectly understandable, and I dare say universally preferable. We can call the absence of this universal aggression order. If we accept this, then we must necessarily recognize that any double standard in the absence of universal aggression is therefore not order. If this is the case, then the double standards implicit in government. When you steal from someone, it's burglary and theft. When the state does it, it's taxation or fines. When you kill someone, it's murder or manslaughter. When the state does it, it's execution or war. The actions are the same. The results nearly identical. The only difference at all are the labels that the government arbitrarily apply to it. How can the state be anything except chaos? What people want is justice. The sooner they shake off this archaic belief that justice can only be achieved through a coercive monopoly, the sooner we can start achieving true order, in which theft is theft, whether one calls themselves a burglar or a tax collector, where justice is based on natural law and not the arbitrary whims of legislators. The only real order is spontaneous order. Everything else is a Chinese bootleg. A really, really crappy Chinese bootleg.
Fascism is tribalistic, but so are humans to a degree. To claim individualism to be the panacea of the West and extol anti-tribalism, when all the while your enemies are using it to their advantage, is about...
Cutting out the unnecessarily wordy metaphor, there are no anti-tribalistic political philosophies that I am aware of, except atomism, so this is a straw man. I presume this is meant to address European social democracy or democratic socialism and the other forms of softcore Marxism that's overtaken Europe. But if you pay attention to their actions, these globalist philosophies are actually extremely tribalistic. They aren't bringing hordes of migrants into their gated communities, and you know why? Because they are extremely protective of their tribe. The mistake you're making is assuming that you and the political ruling elite share the same tribe. You don't. And in fact, they don't care for your tribe at all. Scratch that. They despise your tribe. Well, they despise mine too, so you and I have that in common. But they'll fight like hell to preserve their tribe, the political ruling class. Because it gives them power, they'll also fight to preserve the Muslim tribes. The reason for this is very simple. The extent to which they destabilize society is the extent to which people like you or I cry out for the state to come in and solve these problems, under the belief that the state could ever work in our interest. This is my understanding of the appeal behind fascism. People see the culture and traditions they previously took for granted being demonized and dismantled in real time, and the political philosophy whose rhetoric appeals to in-group preferences is by far the most appealing. However, this makes two fatal assumptions. First, that the state preserves culture. The state is responsible for the dismantling of culture to begin with. The regime of open borders, which is erroneously blamed on the dismantling of culture, is ultimately a government program, as much as closed borders are. After all, governments in the West have dominion over roads, bridges, avenues of transportation, calling them public spaces. Of course, no government can demonstrate any form of legitimate ownership since everything that they have was either stolen or requisitioned. People who would otherwise not be welcome had this infrastructure been privately owned are encouraged inside, and the native population are forced to associate with them, made even worse by the Western government's charity with the money of their population in favor of so-called refugees. I don't think I need to go into detail here. I'm sure you understand it well enough, but it doesn't take a genius to recognize that if a Syrian can make the equivalent of $10,000 a year working his ass off in Syria, or make the equivalent of $50,000 a year sitting on his ass in Germany, well, the first rule of economics is that human beings respond to incentives. I'm sure you're also familiar with the extent of Western powers' military intervention in the Middle East, displacing people from their homes, millions killed in Iraq and Afghanistan by the US, Libya being turned into an open-air slave market, US foreign policy being dictated by the preservation of the dollar as the only currency in which petroleum is valued, and millions of civilians being caught in the crossfire. I can assure you, it's not the migrants who make it illegal to criticize Islam on Twitter. It's not the imams or clerics who force you to pay fines for blaspheming the pedophile prophet of Islam. Oh, whoops, did I just say that out loud? It's the state. It's in their interest to belittle you, to mock you, and to restrict what you can and cannot say or do and make you a second-class citizen in your own country. Well, third class actually. Which brings me to the second fatal assumption, that the government cares what you think. We know, at least in the US, that they don't give a damn about what we think. The likelihood of a proposal being passed into legislation is identical if it has 0% popular support or 100% popular support. Anytime the state does act in ways that correspond with our interests, we can be absolutely certain that they do not do so on our behalf or to our benefit. Their interests are completely independent from yours or mine, and although they may intersect sometimes, we cannot fall for the propaganda that this intersection is proof of responsiveness. The reason that they do not preserve our culture and try to dismantle it actively through demographic displacement is because democratic displacement is in their interests. Their interest is power, first and foremost. Catering to your interests does not give them power. For this reason alone, well, they don't even know who you are. I find it very strange, actually. I think we both understand the political ruling class is seeking to advance the interests of its own tribe. The difference is that what you advocate for would give the ruling class absolute power over society. What I advocate for, anarchism, would eradicate the ruling class, the same tribe that is currently undermining our cultures. Who among us will actually be able to preserve our cultures?
There is no fear of the law, and there is no fear of the consequence of breaking it. The law was never meant to be there to guide the innocent and gently correct and rehabilitate criminals. It is there to protect the innocent and punish criminals.
Law and legislation are different things. Law is a normative standard of right and wrong. Legislation, which is what I assume you're discussing when you say law, are arbitrary statutes decided upon by a group of people who call themselves a legislature. It exists to victimize the innocent and enrich the criminals. Criminals being thieves, kidnappers, and murderers who call themselves tax collectors, police officers, and soldiers, or otherwise government agents. There is no respect for the law because the state has usurped law and made it arbitrary, operating entirely under the because I said so principle. If we were to apply legislation consistently, then the state must necessarily cease and desist all tax collection, punishment of victimless crimes, detention, military activity, among other things, to be in compliance with their own statutes. The only other option is to repeal all legislation that makes illegal the acts of murder, theft, and kidnapping.
Now, my simple little mantra is order above all else, and yes, I know that sounds scary, but people have just had enough of lawlessness.
Order above all else. I like it. So because the state is so utterly lawless, if we want order, we must have anarchism.
The way I interpret fascism is that it is a natural opposition to chaos, anarchy, and, by extension, communism.
The way I interpret fascism is an embrace of chaos that's cosplaying as law and order, despite being neither law nor order for reasons I described previously. Law and order, absent the arbitrary standards of a coercive monopoly or the double standards of a two-tiered society that are necessary for a government to function, can only be achieved by private law firms competing with one another for the interests and the patronage of their customers. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a communist. I'm not going to go into communism either, but it's just not my preference for an economic organization. However, I'm not sure what problem you really have with communism, since both fascism and communism are forms of authoritarian collectivism.
It doesn't need to be violent. It doesn't need to be genocidal. It doesn't need to be imperial, even. In fact, I'd argue that a military should be almost entirely defensive.
Could a fascist state not be genocidal? Sure. Could it not be imperial? I can grant that, but it's always going to be violent. There's no way around this. And it's not a knock on fascism either. All states are violent, without exception. And yes, that includes liberal states. All demand a percentage of the property of their citizenry to function, and this demand is backed by the use of force. Failure to comply with the arbitrary whims of the rulers results in force being escalated against you until you either comply or die. Now, I don't think Jactian is trying to be deceptive, just that he doesn't recognize the gun in the room in the relationship between the people and the state, that you can't even disassociate from the state.
I want to see strong laws, harsh punishment for criminals, protection against seditionists which seek to undermine the nation and threaten its people.
Earlier, he makes arguments against free speech, but I wanted to play this clip because here he makes the argument for free speech better than I could.
Protection against seditionists which seek to undermine the nation and threaten its people.
Using his own rules and logic, Jactian, you are guilty of sedition and subverting your nation, as you seek to overthrow the democratic liberal government and replace it with one structured to your own preference. Now, I personally am not against sedition, in fact, quite the opposite. But as for you, it's hypocritical to advocate against sedition when you yourself are engaged in sedition. But here's the thing. All sedition restrictions do is victimize people whose only crime is to express opinions the ruling class disapproves of. Their basis for doing so, well, they have no basis. Person A might say it's wrong for person B to express their opinions, but then person C says that person A is wrong for expressing disapproval of person B. Person D says that person C is wrong. On what basis can you distinguish who is correct? You might decide that person A is correct about how wrong B's sedition is, but how do you know? Because some group of people called government said so? Well, how do they know? Well, why do they have that authority? The people gave it to them? So then person B, who is part of the people, empowered someone else to victimize him? No, it was the majority? Well, who empowered them? The government? I think you can see where this is going. You can't argue against free speech without appealing to circular reasoning. The argument against free speech, or any right derived from self-ownership, doesn't work, unless one rejects all of science and logic.
I don't care for the whole give me freedom or give me death bollocks. Go and ask one of the little girls who died in the Manchester bombings if she would rather be free or would she rather be alive. You
just spent a lot of time criticizing liberalism, and yet you just use one of the most cliched liberal arguments, the false binary. The reason they're dead is because the government forces people to associate with the population harboring terrorists. Don't spit in my face and tell me it's raining. I can see what's going on.
Consider why we believe it is our right to challenge all authority and that we have a human right to protest and assemble with whom we choose.
The burden of proof is not on us as to why we should be able to challenge authority. Authority is making a positive claim that it ought to rule over us, and we ought to submit to their arbitrary whims. The burden of proof is on them to prove why. So far, they have failed to do so without appealing to circular reasoning.
Bolster our military defensive capabilities, conscript the unemployed if you have to.
unironically advocating for enslaving people to be used as cannon fodder is when one should realize they've gone too far.
I want to return to tradition. Stop promoting every fucking deviant behaviour as being unique and vibrant and harmless. It's not that harmless. I don't think it's any coincidence that the rise in children identifying as the wrong gender seems to have come about at a time where our media is hell-bent on pushing the issue down everyone's throats.
The trans trenders, the SJW Snowflake Brigade, the horror show that are the Pride Parades, I despise the pandering to these sick people as well. So that begs the question, why does the state do this? Because it gives them power. It makes people like us who don't like seeing it want the power of the political ruling class to increase by giving them an excuse to decide who people can and cannot have sex with.
Some censorship is justified, whether you like it or not.
For someone who really does not want their culture to go down the toilet, you're really trying hard to empower the ones flushing the damn thing.
4. I believe in strong morals.
Bro, morals are ethics applied, and you're unironically arguing for authoritarianism, one of the most immoral philosophies on the face of the earth. And I'm not just saying that because, I arbitrarily think states are immoral. No. States are perpetually engaged in theft, kidnapping, and murder through taxation, legislation enforcement, and foreign policy. These aren't bugs. These are features. And if you want to try to get around this, well, we both know that your fascist dictatorship won't be crowdfunded or paid with voluntary donations. If theft were ethical, it wouldn't be called theft, would it? The hypocrisy of government-enforced morality is as obvious as an obese dietitian. The only government that accurately reflects morality and ethics are ones that don't exist. And you may try to enforce morality through government mandate for a while, but ultimately people are only going to respect it insofar as it avoids getting them in trouble. In which case, people acting morally or ethically has nothing to do with whether or not it's actually in their best interest to do so, and it's simply a question of what you can and cannot get away with.
I'm talking about things which are morally abhorrent but not illegal, such as marital adultery. Perhaps it could carry some form of censure, such as a fine. I believe we need to promote traditional Christian values and the unity of the church and the unity of people.
You don't need force to convince people of good ideas. If adultery were truly a bad thing, then make the case. Convince people with facts, reason, and logic that this is the case. At the bare minimum, you should be able to associate with like-minded people. Using force to coerce people to your preferred lifestyles shows your lack of confidence in your own beliefs. By your own actions, you confess either the weakness of your words, your inability to convince people, or the weakness of your ideas, as you are unable to convince people to your way of thinking. Now, I say this as a Catholic. I don't believe in sex before marriage, let alone adultery. But these are choices free people are able to make. God gave man free will. And I have enough confidence in the case against adultery that I don't feel the need whatsoever to coerce people to agree with me. It's unfortunate you think so little of Christian values that you don't believe people would adopt them voluntarily.
Because deep down I think we all know what's right from wrong.
The continued belief in statism in general demonstrates this clearly is not the case. Now, there's not much worth addressing, but I'll leave my final thoughts. Fascism has its appeal in people who see very real problems involving their culture, people, and society deteriorating, and this philosophy promises to remedy that by any means necessary. The trouble is that by doing so, they empower the very people causing the degeneracy, pinky promising to do the opposite of what they are already doing, even though the hangnails on their ring finger are of greater importance to them than what you think. It's not going to work. In Jack the Inn, I sense a kind of impatience. There's been too much discussion in his mind as to what's right and wrong, and he has a gut feeling that something is horribly wrong.
Because deep down, I think we all know what's right from wrong.
There is something wrong. It's horribly wrong, and I'm sympathetic to it. But any power you give to your friends is power that will be used against you later. What do you suppose happens to you if the Islamists get a hold of your fascist dictatorship? It's not going to stop any degeneracy or Islamic invasion, it'll institutionalize it. The siren song of fascism makes you dance to the tune of the political ruling class, and they are laughing at you. It distracts you from direct action that would actually affect political change, namely, creating peer-to-peer economic networks, exchanging goods and services outside the purview of the state, and by depriving them of tax revenue, they cannot subsidize the lifestyles of migrants or degenerates. And once this reaches critical mass, the state will collapse under the weight of the political ruling class's largesse. But in all fairness, it's not like fascism could fund itself either. Questions, comments, critique? What do you think? I made this video while working on my 2008 financial crisis video, so expect that one soon. Or, if you're from the future, check out my explanation of the 2008 financial crisis. It's glorious, I promise. Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.